Today we're going to talk about substance use across the lifespan. The agenda will be that first we'll define process addictions, then we'll compare and contrast with substance addictions, and then we'll begin on our topic of substance use from youth to older adults. I just want to make a note that through this presentation, I'm going to encourage that you might pause and stop and read the resources with the links provided before you continue. That'll be important in order for you to sort of engage with this online unit. So starting with this slide, process addictions. What I encourage is that you review the following two links before proceeding to the remaining slides. So again, you'll want to pause this presentation and make sure you refer to the CAMH link and the problem gambling link below before you proceed with this presentation. When you're ready, join us back. Let's compare and contrast. So based on what you read, I want you to think about your top 3 points that you learned about problem gambling as one of the example process addictions. Can you think of similarities between process addictions and substance addiction that we talked about in class? And what are notable differences between process addictions and substance use? So again, we're looking at similarities as well as differences. The answer to those last two questions. So let's talk about similarities first. Similarities between process and substance addiction, you might have picked up on that both involve quote unquote dysfunctional behavior and are habit forming. They also involve what we talk about as cognitive distortions and deficits in decision making. So cognitive distortions can be simply termed as thinking errors. We all make them, and we make plenty of them in our day. But what we mean in relation to substance and process addictions is that we have distortions about sort of the harms and consequences that these addictions might be causing us. We have distortions about thinking that they might be more beneficial than we recognize. Both process and substance addiction have rituals and trigger arousal. So again, that involves our physiology in terms of the arousal that I'm referring to here. Unfortunately, the reality of the work that we do is that there is low treatment success rate for both process and substance use addiction. In other words, I always like to say that relapse is more common than not. So it's something to look at as a way that you can integrate into treatment with your client and work on as a learning experience rather than assuming and being ignorant of the fact that, again, relapse is a common occurrence. There's also a decline in enjoyment of the activity over time, whether it's process addiction or substance use. And there's a perceived loss of control. So it gets to a point, whether it's process or substance use, it gets to a point where the individual feels as though they don't have actual control over it anymore. In terms of the notable differences, again, from the article, what I hope you picked up on is that substance addiction leads to ingesting of a substance, of course, as opposed to a process addiction, which encompasses behavior. So that's a huge difference between the two. One is involving substances and the other is not. It's involving behavior. And you cannot equate tolerance and withdrawal when it comes to process addictions for those reasons. Because again, tolerance and withdrawal relate to physiology and the impact on our body. And so the same can't be said for process addictions. So those are the biggest differences. Most experts recognize 5 process addictions, and they are sexual addiction, gambling addiction, work addiction, compulsive buying, and food and disordered eating. You'll see I put a note there because food and disordered eating has, by some, been classified more so as a self-harming behavior rather than an addiction, although all of these can tie into self-harming behavior. So just keep that in mind. So again, what I encourage is that you pause at the slide, take a moment and choose any one of the following 5, whichever one kind of stands out and interests you most, and then answer the questions on the following slide. So you choose one of the 5 and then answer these questions. Is there a particular group or population who is more at risk to develop the process addiction you've chosen? Please explain. What are some similarities of the causes and consequences of the process addiction and a substance addiction? So you'll draw on the former learning for that one, as well as the differences in terms of causes and consequences. And then lastly, you should refer to your unit materials and resources for assistance in drawing on these similarities and differences. So once you've jotted down your answers to those questions, you can come back to the presentation and we will continue. All right, so hopefully you came up with something similar to what I'm about to share. Is there a particular group or population who's more at risk to develop your process addiction? So there are specific process addictions that tend to be more gender and age specific. For example, this kind of makes sense, youth, the elderly, as well as competitive athletes may be more at risk for developing a gambling problem, whereas females tend to be more at risk for the compulsive shopping and disordered eating. So again, you might have found even more differences in terms of population and grouping, but these are just a couple of examples that relate to the process addictions. Similarities between process addictions and substance addictions. So I'm just hammering this point home. Both process and substance addictions have significant impact and consequences to one's physical and emotional health, as well as relationships and finances. And with your specific process addiction, you might have gone into more detail about these impacts that it can have. The differences between process and substance, again, as stated in your slides, process addictions involve behavioral actions, whereas substance use involves ingesting a substance. There's also a recognition that societal attitudes towards process versus substance addictions might actually differ. For example, sad but true, work addiction may actually be viewed as positive among Canadian society. And so it kind of flies under the radar, and yet it can still have all of those impacts on a person's daily functioning, their interpersonal relationships, and so forth. So it becomes this so-called silent addiction. Okay, so we've got an understanding of substance and process addiction, similarities and differences, and how it applies. Now we're going to look at the specific populations as mentioned, from youth to older adults. So let's find the facts. There are unique individual characteristics for both youth versus older adults. There are trends that we're going to look at. We're also going to talk about differences in triggers, as well as the impact that the substance and process addictions can have on a biopsychosocial level. And so for the following slides, what I'm going to ask is that you choose either. So you get a choice. You choose either youth or older adults, whichever you're most interested in. Read the materials and then answer the questions, and you'll bring the responses to class. So for youth, you're going to locate the Ontario Student Drug Use and Health Survey, which is a really important document for you to familiarize yourself with if you're hoping to work with youth or if you have been working with youth. It's published by CAMH. The link is directly there. So if your interest is in youth, then I'm going to go to the next slide and pause so that you can review the materials and then join us when you're ready. Okay, so the questions that you are going to answer are how rates of tobacco and alcohol use based on the 2015 survey compare to the mid-1980s. You're going to describe changes in the rates of cannabis that occurred in the 90s, 2000s to now. And you're also going to look at how rates of drug use compare across the various regions throughout Ontario. So what are some of the differences across the provinces? And then there's a personal reflection piece below as well. So again, if your choice is youth, please pause the video here, look at the Ontario Drug Use and Health Survey, and then come back to the video when you're ready. All right, so if you're joining us back having done the youth activity, then here we go. Rates of tobacco and alcohol use from the past to present. So current rates of tobacco and alcohol use among Ontario students are significantly less than they were in the 1980s and are the lowest in the last 35 years of history. So that's a win. The changes in rates of cannabis use, so overall cannabis has also declined since the early 2000s, another win, until now. Rates of cannabis peaked in the late 1970s, declined in the mid to late 1980s before spiking again in the 90s and early 2000s, and current rates suggest roughly 21% of students surveyed report having used cannabis during the previous year. It'll be interesting to see how the new Canada legislation will affect rates of cannabis use. And drug use across the various regions. So overall rates of alcohol use and drug use do not appear to significantly differ across the province, although in more urban and rural areas, we see some increases in the use of specific drugs. And then I'll leave the personal reflection for you to bring to class. If your choice was older adults, then I'm going to go to the next slide and pause and encourage that you review the links provided here and then answer the questions on the following slide. So these are your questions. What is the prevalence of mental health issues in older adults? What are the 4 core elements of a senior framework? What are 2 reasons substance use in older adults may be overlooked? And then the personal reflection questions for you to bring to class. So again, I'm going to pause here. You can review your links and answer your questions and then come back to the video. So to answer those questions, the prevalence of mental health issues in older adults is 17 to 30% of older adults in terms of the prevalence of having mental health issues. And that's probably an underreport even at that. It's probably even higher. And the 4 core elements of a senior framework are community-based care, collaborative efforts across all sectors to deliver a social model of care. There's a lot of loneliness and isolation with this population. There's a recovery-based approach involving family, client and family involvement in system planning, implementation, and evaluation. And 2 reasons substance use in older adults may be overlooked are because they are more likely to drink or use drugs at home rather than in public, so it's a little more hidden. They also might not have duties that are affected by their substance use. If they're not going to work or to school, it might go, again, under the radar and unnoticed. A couple of more reasons are that signs of substance use, are similar to those found in health problems. So again, there's an overlap there and it might be under-recognized or underlooked. And lastly, caregivers of older adults may be aware of the problem, but they might not want to talk about it. It just might be an uncomfortable thing. So that's our job as social service workers, is to talk about it, reduce the stigma. I hope this online exercise was helpful.